And with less than a week left of Donald Trump's presidency, we're going to be talking about what his successor, Joe Biden, can do to address one of the cruelest and most inhumane aspects of the federal law, and that's the death penalty. And particularly, it's the ability of any president, like Donald Trump, to carry it out whenever he sees fit. And so over the past few months, we have seen the federal government execute people. And this is something that they've done after a 17-year hiatus. Over nearly a dozen people have been executed by this federal government. And just this week, we are looking at 3 executions. So on Tuesday, the federal government killed Lisa Montgomery, who was the first woman to be executed in nearly 70 years. And also this week, they are set to execute Corey Johnson and Dustin Hicks. Now, both of these individuals are Black men who, like so many people who are incarcerated right now, have contracted COVID. They're set to be executed this week. And so to say that this is a heinous and unjust and inhumane end to Trump's presidency is an understatement. But looking forward, we're going to talk about what Joe Biden can do to address this terrible legacy and to end the death penalty, to take steps to end the death penalty once and for all. And so to talk a little bit about how he can do that, we also need to talk about how we got here in the first place. So when former President Obama was president, he committed to not overseeing federal executions. In other words, federal executions would not happen under his watch. But that doesn't mean that he saved the people who are on federal death row. People like Alfred Bourgeois, Lisa Montgomery, Brandon Bernard. He just left it so that the next president would be able to resume those executions. And so now Joe Biden is saying the same thing. He is saying that he will not carry out executions. Executions won't happen on his watch. But although he has indicated his opposition to the death penalty, he hasn't committed to doing something that President Obama should have done, which is commute the sentences of people who are on death row, federal death row, to life without parole. And if Joe Biden doesn't do that, he's essentially going to make it so that another president could pick up exactly where Donald Trump left off, executing people on federal death row. And so if Biden truly opposes the death penalty, he needs to take direct action. He needs to halt it immediately by commuting the sentences of people who are on death row and reducing them to life without parole. And so to talk more about how this process would work and what else can be done to erase the stain of the federal death penalty, I'm so pleased to be joined by someone who can walk us through this, and that's Robert Dunham. He is the executive director of the Death Penalty Information Center. Robert, thank you so much for joining me today on The Appeal Live.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So with Biden about to take office, I know lawmakers are preparing to introduce a bill to abolish the federal death penalty. And that's super important. But just sort of setting that aside for a moment, what can Biden do himself to help people who are already on federal death row? Would you be able to lay out the options that he has to save those folks?
There are a number of things that he can do immediately, and there are other things that he can do over the course of time. Immediately, he can issue an order saying that the federal government will no longer prosecute any capital cases. And so possible death penalty cases would proceed without the death penalty being sought. He can tell the Attorney General to decapitalize, that is, take death off the table in the cases in which the death penalty is currently being pursued. And in cases that are on appeal, if the prisoner has won the appeal, he can withdraw the government's appeal. So those are some things that he can do immediately. He also can do, and this is what George Gascon did when he was elected district attorney in Los Angeles. He can also commit to an immediate review of all the cases that are currently on death row and see if there is legal error in those cases, and then bring the legal error to the court. He doesn't have the authority to just convert those through the court system from death to life, but he can, the term is confess error. He can admit that prejudicial error occurred, and then the courts could reverse those. But basically, the single most powerful thing that he can do is grant clemency. Presidents have the absolute power to commute sentences. And by a stroke of the pen, he can commute all of death row, or he can look at the cases individually. And that's something that the Obama administration did not do. It only granted clemency in 2 cases, essentially kicking the can down the road and creating the circumstances in which we could have this historically aberrant spree of federal executions.
And that's not for lack of people asking Obama to do that. There were folks who were begging Obama to commute death row, meaning that, just like you said, those folks would be serving life sentences instead. And then Trump came into power, hit the pause, unpaused the pause button, so to speak. And so now that you've laid out all of these options, and sort of looking backward at sort of some of the mistakes that former President Obama made, how should Biden learn from this? And what it seems like you're saying that clemency is probably the option that he should take first. Is that sort of a right statement to make?
Well, what he should learn from this, and his career seems to be that he learns from history, is that not doing anything, which essentially is what a moratorium is, not doing anything simply creates the possibility that somebody down the road is going to do what Donald Trump did. Now, I mean, that's not to say that anyone could have predicted that we would elect a president who would seek to execute people in violation of the law and do so with impunity. The excesses of the Trump administration are unparalleled when it comes to executions, unparalleled in American history. But I think that is a critical lesson. Opponents of capital punishment have been saying for years that this is not a policy that you can trust the government with. And one of the things that they have argued is that some hypothetical president at some point may engage in excesses. The opponents were told over and over by proponents of capital punishment that was nonsensical, that we have much more responsible leaders than that, and that the death penalty would be carried out sparingly and according to law. Well, we now know that is not the case. And I think that Joe Biden understands that and has learned from that. He learned from his sponsorship of the Death Penalty Act in the 1990s, and his view has changed as he's seen that 174 innocent people have been convicted and sentenced to death and subsequently exonerated in the United States. And that's why he says he now thinks the federal death penalty should end. I think if he really has learned, we'll find out soon whether his views are political rhetoric or political policy.
I want to go back to this one method, and excuse me if I'm saying it incorrectly, but that you talked about, where the government can confess error. And I think about how useful that would be, because something that we've seen in so many death penalty cases is how a lot of it is often a result of poor representation at the trial level, poverty. So could you expand a little bit about how that would work and how that could make a real difference
Sure.
in the death penalty moving forward?
One of the really significant problems with the federal death penalty, and this is endemic in state systems as well, is that the quality of representation is spotty and often horrific. In the federal death penalty, half of all the death sentences came from just 3 states. That's Virginia, Missouri, and Texas. And it's not surprising that those are states that have had some of the worst state criminal defense systems. For years, incompetent lawyers or substandard lawyers or lawyers who were lacking in resources were appointed to handle these federal cases. And now when competent lawyers have become involved at the very end of the case, they are unable to raise the issues because they're considered to be waived. What an administration can do is, on its own, it can assess the quality of representation. And if it believes that there was ineffective representation, and new counsel can point out what those issues are, it can say to the courts, this was ineffective representation, and we are not going to contest the grant of a new sentencing hearing. And so the death penalty in that case can be overturned. Or if the federal government has statistics on the way in which it pursued the death penalty, it can say, we have a record that in this district or in this state or in this region of the country, the federal death penalty was pursued in a discriminatory manner. And if that issue is raised, they can confess error, and the courts can correct that. There are also a series of procedural defenses that we're seeing that are being interposed to try to execute this spree of 13 prisoners. And over and over and over, the government is saying it doesn't matter whether there was a constitutional violation or not. The issue was procedurally barred. Well, the government can waive the presentation of procedural defenses, so the courts get to hear the issues on the merits. We so often hear proponents of capital punishment talking about the endless review of capital cases, and cases have been in the courts for years and years and years. But the length of time that a case is in the court doesn't tell us anything about the quality of review any more than the length of time you wait with an airport delay tells you about the quality of the flight. And so the government can say, we're not going to interpose these procedural defenses. These issues are going to be heard on the merits.
So I want to shift a little bit to talk about legislation and Congress. So we know that we've talked a lot about what Joe Biden can do, and he certainly doesn't play a passive role in this aspect either. But I was hoping you can talk a little bit about what Congress can do specifically to abolish the federal death penalty, and how Joe Biden can assist in those efforts.
Well, Congress is going to be introducing legislation to abolish the death penalty. Ayanna Pressley and others have already introduced legislation in the House. Senator Dick Durbin and others are going to be introducing the legislation in the Senate. And interestingly, Kamala Harris, still a senator, is one of the co-sponsors, along with Cory Booker and Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders. And name all of the presidential candidates, Amy Klobuchar, all of them who are in the Senate are co-sponsors of the bill to abolish the death penalty. There will be a question about how aggressively that legislation moves through. And Joe Biden's administration will play a big role in that. There could be very prompt action. Is it one of the things he wants to accomplish within the first 100 days? Or there could be delayed action. He can say that the fact that I'm not seeking the death penalty in any cases and won't be going ahead with executions takes the pressure off. But the fact is that this may be an historic moment. Never before in American history have presidential abuses of capital punishment been so clear. And so this might be one of those historic moments where the iron is hot and it's time to strike. We'll see very soon what the president's priorities are. And again, this will be a measure of whether his commitment is political rhetoric or is actually part of what he wants to accomplish.
And what do you think are going to be some of the obstacles to, getting him to?
Well, I think one of the biggest obstacles to repealing the death penalty is the fact that no repeal bill in the states, and certainly I think at the federal level, is ever going to be passed if it's perceived as partisan. The death penalty has become increasingly less partisan over the years. In the 1990s, opposition to capital punishment was political poison, and if you opposed the death penalty, you were likely to lose your seat. That's not the case anymore. But the fact is that you cannot assume that because Democrats have the majority in the House and can break a tie in the Senate, that they can force a death penalty repeal bill through. Not all Democrats support repealing the death penalty. And at the same time, you can't assume that Republicans, because they're Republican, oppose the death penalty. We're now at the point where 20% of conservatives say that they oppose capital punishment. So for the bill to pass, I think it's going to be critical that there be bipartisanship and that there be cooperation across the aisle. And death penalty opponents will be making a very serious mistake if they try to rush things through without ensuring that there is at least some level of bipartisan support.
Absolutely. I think that the death penalty is definitely something that can sort of transcend politics. And we're at the end of the day talking about life, human life. Um, and so interested to sort of hear, do you have any insight on sort of how those talks amongst elected officials have been going? And if not exact insight, what you can imagine is happening right now?
Well, we don't know. The Biden administration has actually been very good at not revealing what it is intending to do, and I think that one of the things that we've heard in terms of speculation is that the administration wants to think carefully about the policy and would like to have a commission or some special body similar to the one that President Obama said he was going to put together but never came about to examine the federal death penalty and to make recommendations. I think if there is not a repeal, then that is likely to be the path that he takes before commutation. He would like to have that be something that he is able to point to a document, point to something well thought out and well researched, to say that this is not something that we can deal with on a case by case basis. The system is broken, and even if people support the death penalty in the abstract and maybe support it in individual cases, it's not good justification for policy. So I think that we may be seeing that kind of commission being appointed to review. The other kinds of things, though, that I think that can be done go beyond the federal death penalty. They go to the federal government's authority to affect state death penalties. The biggest way that the federal government affects state death penalties is through federal habeas corpus law, the federal appeals process. And that appeals process has been so limited by 1994 amendments to the federal habeas corpus statute that federal courts are no longer able to act like real judges. We think that a case goes into federal court, and if there's an error, the judge just corrects it. But that's not the case. Federal judges are prevented from overturning unconstitutional death sentences and granting fair trials unless the defendant is able to show that the state court misapplied clearly established United States Supreme Court case law. And so if the state court got it wrong and the conviction or death sentence is illegal or unconstitutional, that's not enough for a federal court to do the right thing and ensure that the defendant gets a fair trial or isn't unconstitutionally executed. So one of the important things, I think, would be to take action on the habeas corpus statute and make sure that federal courts are allowed to act like federal courts. We're seeing case after case now of defendants who are reaching the point of execution who say that DNA will prove them innocent. And they are unable to get DNA testing under state law, and the federal courts are not granting it to them. We've seen at least 5 people whom I believe were innocent executed in the space of the last 2 years. And what a Biden administration could do is condition law enforcement grants or condition grants to the state court systems upon making DNA testing or other forensic testing available so that you don't have to ask the question, what are they trying to hide by not allowing the DNA testing to take place? There are dozens of regulatory types of things. There are dozens of conditions on grants that the administration can pursue, and it'll be interesting to see whether they do so.
And do you see any states who have really done this the right way? We know actually that a lot of states don't have the death penalty, and many who do don't use it. But do we see any states that were really able to abolish it using sort of a lot of the methods you've talked about, garnering bipartisan support, that Joe Biden could potentially model his path off of?
I think that Virginia is a really good model. Virginia, a bill to abolish the death penalty was just introduced yesterday. And it has the support of the governor, and it has the support of the attorney general, and it has the support of a number of progressive prosecutors. I think Maybe it's the proximity to Washington, but maybe it's the fact that this would be the first state in the Deep South, the first member of the Confederacy, to possibly abolish the death penalty. I think the administration can take a look at that and see that abolition in what used to be considered unlikely places is possible. We had abolition in Colorado. We had a conservative legislature vote to abolish the death penalty in Nebraska before it was overturned by referendum. We have seen progressive evidence, more and more evidence, that fiscal conservatives and right to life Republicans are opposing the death penalty. And Joe Biden, throughout his career, has had the ability to join hands with people on the other side of the aisle.
That's his
I think
strength.
that is where his abilities, his personality, and his genuine conversion on this issue can play a major role in bringing about abolition if that is what he wants to do.
Well, let's hope that he goes along that path and is able to be successful there. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. But actually, I do have one more question before we wrap up.
Okay.
Can you give us an update on the lives of the people who are affected by the death penalty right now, the federal death penalty, Dustin Higgs and Corey Johnson? What's happening in their case?
There's a lot. Earlier today, Corey Johnson, who is intellectually disabled, still had litigation pending on 4 different issues in 2 different circuits. He is challenging his execution on the grounds that he's intellectually disabled, but he's never been provided an opportunity for an evidentiary hearing on that. And the ineffectiveness claim that he brought about his counsel's failure to raise the issue properly was resolved using unscientific standards for assessing intellectual disability. That he has lost in the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit. That's on its way to the U.S. Supreme Court. He is still litigating the question about whether the death warrant date was imposed in violation of the original sentencing order in his case. He was convicted in a court that issued a stay of execution until further order of this court. And there never has been further order of that court. So the question is, did the government pursue his execution in an appropriate manner? There is also litigation over whether the execution process is cruel and unusual punishment as inflicted on somebody who has contracted COVID. This is one of the very important and also maddening issues that we've seen recently, because states and the federal government moved to lethal injection in order to carry out executions in a way that was less inhumane and less painful. But we now have autopsy results, more than 200 autopsies of executed prisoners, that shows that the execution process by lethal injection is anything but painless, anything but humane. The evidence shows that 84% of the autopsies indicated that prisoners suffered what's called pulmonary edema, which is a very painful condition. It is fluid on the lungs, sometimes associated with blood in the lungs. And in around half of the cases, the prisoners also had frothing and foam that emanated from the lungs and moved up into the airways and into
This has been
esophagus.
Waterboarding, correct?
That's what a federal judge said is akin to waterboarding plus suffocation. So in one, you have the sense of the water coming down on you and you're drowning and you're being waterboarded. The other is that because your lungs are becoming paralyzed, you are unable at the same time to attempt to breathe and to take air in. Well, we know now that is that is a terrifying experience and an extremely painful experience. And when you add to that lung damage caused by COVID-19, and that's been documented with X-rays for Corey Johnson. I'm not sure about Dustin Higgs. We know from other cases of COVID that if your lungs are already compromised, other things are going to get worse. So if you have compromised lungs and you add on top of that another condition that attacks the lungs, and that's essentially what the lethal injection is, it is going to be much more painful. The medical testimony indicates that even if the pentobarbital that the government intends to use to carry out the executions, even if it were to work as a sedative, there would be a period of time before it goes to work in which Mr. Johnson and Mr. Higgs would already be experiencing extreme pain as a result of COVID and their already compromised lungs.
And we see how, we have two men who potentially will undergo an execution that could be akin to torture in many ways as a result of the previous administration not commuting their sentences to life. And so that's something that we all hope that our next president, Joe Biden, can learn from and can do the right thing moving forward and ensure that nobody ever has to go through this again. So thank you so much for joining us today, for walking us through all of the ways that our next administration can do things differently. And I look forward to talking to you again. Thanks so much.
My pleasure. Always happy to be with you.
Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. This has been The Appeal Live. I'm Alana Sivan. We'll see you next time.